And so it is the continuum now of this month as we root ourselves in the awareness that indeed we are rooted in the divine. And today that's showing up as us looking at what God's will is all about. And of course, God's will is not something that we're unfamiliar with, because I don't know about you, but from the time I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I heard all the time, well, God's holy will be done. And if it is God's will, and so on. And we're looking at this today to see what we're making of it now. Where are we with the will of God right now? What do we think about the will of God right now? Do we think the same way as we did when we were 4 or 5 or 6 or 7? I know for me, my idea of God's will has dramatically changed as a small child. I wasn't too fussed about God's will. I didn't really want to hear about it much because I always thought it was associated with doing things that you didn't want to do and hard and difficult things, because we're always invited to be sacrificial in our lives and living and make great sacrifices and so on. And so when it came to the Lord's Prayer, I would kind of mumble over, "Thy will be done," because I wasn't too keen on stressing it, you know. And that came out of the idea that, we were raised in an environment, schooling and so on, not at home for me, but in a school environment where one day, Holy God loved us and we were beautiful children. The next day, Holy God was sending us straight to hell. And it was difficult because there was a mixture of this love and fear around God, and kind of like a big brother watching you and ready to catch you out. And if you failed, then punishment and all of that. And it was a strange mixture of things. And yet there was something in me, I know, that really didn't want to focus on any of that. Just wanted to know that God loved me and focus on the love of God and God being a loving Father at that time. And that was difficult because the same time that we're talking about the Good Shepherd and the Lamb of God, we're seeing in Scripture too, the smiting God, the avengeful God, the God who wipes out cities, every man, woman, and child, and every blade of grass. And it was difficult to make sense of all of that. For me anyway, it certainly was. So I always had this thing around the will of God, cautious about it, until I didn't anymore. And so now it's such a freeing thing. It's a great bondage that's been removed from me when I understand what the will of God is all about. Now you hear about the will of God and my will and your will and their will and our will. And there is only one will, that's all. Because the will of God is the very same as the nature of God, is the very same as the power of God. God's will, God's nature, God's power, all one and the same thing. One and the same thing. So how do we get into this sense of, God being out far away up there somewhere, and we being down here somewhere in a much lesser way, and sort of never the twain shall meet, because we're not anywhere equal to that divine communion, because we're raised to think that we're sinners, and so on and so forth. And it begins really when we come into life as a little baby. When you come into life as a little baby, you're brand new. And you come in and you're just full of the nature and the essence and the will of God. You're so close to source. You come in and you're this whole thing. You are this one thing. And it's an awesome thing. And as the baby progresses and so on, the baby begins to have perceptions of its own, thoughts of its own, and feelings of its own. And that is because the baby has been born into a culture, into an environment, into circumstances and family experiences. And as well as that, the soul within and the body within the soul is now in material form. So it takes a while to get used to your density. It takes a while to get used to your physical form once you've come in. But as that happens, what starts is the the egoic personality self beginning to emerge, beginning to grow. And as it does, and as it grows stronger, what happens is the little baby forgets that it's the hub of the universe, just like God. And the little baby goes into the realization in an unconscious way of a dualistic world and into separation and into isolation. Thus is born this tendency to over-identify with the egoic personality, the human self. And the more we get into it, the more we forget, and the more we forget, and the more we forget our divinity. And so thus begins the journey back to self, back to self. And so my will, your personal will, is a conditioned will. It's a conditioned will. It's conditioned by culture, circumstances, situations, and environment, and so on. And so, of course, it's very limited as a consequence of that. And it shows up in all kinds of ways. It certainly shows up in unforgiveness, things that are yet to be unforgiven. It shows up in ways like me wanting my own way all the time. And that's very fierce sometimes in very small children. You can see it, me, mine, you know. So wanting my way all of the time, never being satisfied with what is before me, always wanting more, thinking there's more or whatever, not having the ability to be able to play in the field of relationships in a way that we can be good participants as a team member in a team, but my way or the highway kind of thing. So these characteristics showing up, and there's tons of them, and you know your own, and I know my own, our particular peculiarities in that way. How defiant we can be, how willful we can be. You willful child, we would often hear. And so that we are looking at this week. Are we still playing in that field of separation and isolation and a human egoic personality? Or are we ready now to understand there's one will? It's the will of the divine, and it's the nature of the divine, and it's the power of the divine. That's all there is. So what makes my will is the way I use the will of the divine. That's what makes it my will. The way you use it makes it your will, and so on. And there's group will and so forth. So we look at what exactly is God's will. Well, if God's will is the same as God's nature and the same as God's power, then we know straight away that the will of the divine is always that I should have life and have it in abundance, that my joy may be complete, and that I may know the peace that passes understanding, and that I may experience wholeness and completeness and fullness and harmony and unity and oneness and all that is good, whole, and wholesome, and nothing less than that. Nothing less than that. That is the only will of God. And you and I can take that and make of it what we will. We can either believe this or not. Believe it or not. There was a lovely example given recently about looking at the will of God and the human will by way of looking at a coin. And if you say that one side of the coin is God's will and the other side of the coin is human will, and the God side of the coin will be bright, sparkling, shiny, pristine. The other side will be tarnished, and it depends on how tarnished it is with regard to how we're using the will of God. So you have a tarnished side and you have this pristine side. However, it's one coin, and although one side of it is tarnished, it does not take away from the value of that coin one iota. The value of the coin remains the value of the coin. So your challenge and my challenge is to polish up the side that needs polishing. And the way we do that, Ernest Holmes says, is we must get to the point where we have absolute faith, absolute trust in the omnipotent power of the law of good, divine good. We must get to that point. And he said the only way we're going to get to that point is if we develop a practice of good thought and poise of heart and a confident spirit. And he says if we can do that, then we can free ourselves from the bondage of the conditioned life. The conditioned life. And that's what we're called to do. That is what we can do. That's why we're called to it. It's not that it's not possible for you or me. Of course it is. Or we wouldn't be here. And we certainly wouldn't be here in this room if we didn't know that this is a possibility. So we have to ask ourselves, where am I right now with regard to all of this? Am I still very conditioned by my childhood experiences, and not just religious experience, but all of my childhood experiences? Am I still conditioned by my childhood experiences? Where in my life can I begin with aligning myself with the true essence and the true nature of my will? Because the true essence and the true nature of my will is pristine. It's beauty, it's grace, it's glorious, it's light, it's life, it's magnificent. And that's what we're all endeavoring to do, to align ourselves all of the time with our true essence, our real nature. Our real nature. And of course that happens in the field of mind, in the field of emotion, in the field of action, how we think, how we feel, what we do. All determines how aligned we are or how not aligned we are. So this week the challenge is, let's get this one straight, once and for all. Do I want to be my true essence in expression? Do I really want that? Do I want to demonstrate my reality as a point of power, divine light and life and love, through which the infinite is always endeavoring to express the completeness of itself, the wholeness of itself, and the fullness of itself? Or am I okay to sit back and, same old, status quo, it is what it is? You hear some people say, well, that's just how I am. It's so not just how we are. It's a great lie that we tell ourselves. So if we just picked one area in our lives this week to hone in on, and the two greatest detractors, the two greatest limiters would be unforgiveness and fear. Now, everything's bound up in fear. The fear is the root of all of our worries and cares and troubles. Fear is the root of it. But within that is all of the unresolved stuff, unhealed stuff that you and I tend to cling to. Whether we want to or whether we don't, we seem to be, if we're in the habit of doing that, that's what we're going to do. So to choose maybe one thing that needs healing in our lives, or to choose maybe one thing that we're afraid of that we're going to choose not to be afraid of anymore. Because once we have overcome fear, we're free. Once we overcome fear, know you the truth, and the truth will set you free, we are told. And how do we do that? There's only one way to do that, as all of the great ones have shared, and we have discovered to some extent in our own lives. We have to free fall, surrender. And surrender has nothing to do with becoming less powerful or less anything else either. Surrender, divine Spiritual surrender has to do with free falling into the heart of divine love. Free falling into the heart of divine love. And once we can do that and get into the habit of doing that, we will find that whatever it is we have to correct will be easier to correct. And again, one great writer, and I can't remember who he was, said we only come to spiritual institutions to discover our mistakes and to correct them. Who would have thought? We only come to spiritual institutions to discover our mistakes and to correct them. And that's serious stuff. That's big stuff. And in that way, you can see how he really has the right idea around this, because if we are going to live the life that we truly want to live, and who doesn't want to live a true life? Who doesn't want to live a good life? Who doesn't want to live a flourishing life, a succeeding life, a contented life? I don't know anybody personally who doesn't want that. But to get there, we have to take the steps that bring us there. And we're not going to do it until we acknowledge there's one power, there's one divine essence, there's one life, there's one will. It's good, it's godly. It is only interested in us getting ahead and succeeding and achieving. You see, the divine will is against no thing and no one. It is only for our good and the good of all. That's all the divine will is for. Your good, my good, and the good of all creation, everything and everyone. That's what you and I have to get to in belief. And until we get there in belief, we're always going to be struggling and in and out of separation. So the call for you and for me this week is, we approach Easter and the whole idea of rising up and rising up in consciousness and overcoming our conditioned consciousness is make the effort. Make the effort. Do you really want to know yourself in your truth? I guess so, or we wouldn't be here. Well, then we have to put action underneath that and do what it takes. And the first thing is to face ourselves down, to look into the mirror and face ourselves down and tell ourselves the truth, even if the truth is going to annoy us. Even if we tell ourselves, no, we really haven't been serious about making a real endeavor or a real effort or whatever that is. But to look into the mirror of ourselves and see what's going on. And if there's something there that requires our attention, that needs mending, fixing, and healing, then why are we just holding ourselves back from that? It's going to happen sooner or later, one day or another. It really will. You and I will know ourselves in all our pristine magnificence sooner or later. I think we're here because we want that to happen sooner. And so we must be with ourselves. That's the number one thing. Are you able to be in your own company? Are you able to be in your own company, looking into yourself sincerely and honestly and kindly and lovingly to find out how that progression can happen? Because that's the first thing it takes. You and I getting real with ourselves and saying, yes, I am so ready to spend time in my own company, to get quiet, and to whatever I am moved to do and be in that quiet time, to allow it so that I can get in touch with the deeper life that I am, so that I can be in touch with the divine aspect of my being, so I can get a glimpse again of what that baby knew coming in, of that wholeness and that oneness and that totality of an experience. Are we willing to do that? Because that's what it's going to take from you and from me. And then to be consistent. And what does consistency look like? It means go to that chair that you've picked out to be your prayer chair, your meditation chair, or your God chair, your divine self chair, whatever you want to call it. But to show up every single day, whether you feel like it or not, whether anything's going on in your mind or not, whether you're upset or whether you're all over the place, doesn't matter. Put yourself in the chair, because that's saying, I'm ready. It's telling the universe, I'm showing up. I'm showing up. Look, I'm here. And whatever happens, I showed up. And that's the best you can do. And your best is always wonderful. And your best is always acceptable, if that's your best. But in time, when you get into the practice, it's like anything else. If you're practicing a game on the computer, if you're practicing a violin, if you're practicing a musical instrument, if you take on something new, if you're learning a new language and so on, it's tedious in the beginning. It's very tedious in the beginning. But you stick to it because you really want to know how to play that tune or whatever, speak that language and so forth. And you keep at it, and you keep at it, and you keep at it, and then one day, there you are, doing what you want to do, being how you want to be. So basic, fundamental, bread and butter spiritual stuff is you need to be in your own company every single day for a time, so that you can allow that inner essence of you to speak to you, to contact you, and you be ready to be open and receptive to it. And that's the beginning. That's the very, very beginning of you and I then coming out of separation, coming out of isolation more and more and more until we have unified. And as I say, you don't have to be in the mood to do this, because if you're waiting to be in the mood, God help us all. You do not have to be in the mood to do it. Your feelings have nothing got to do with it. This is an act of will, a decision you're going to make. You're going to make a decision. It's like happiness is not the result of any one thing. It's the result of the choice that I make in every now moment. Happiness begins with a decision, not a feeling, a decision to be happy. So this week, the challenge for us all is to show up every day and put aside a time to be in our own company and get used to doing that. And if nothing happens for a while, don't worry, just show up, sit down, at least you're resting for a moment or two. And start out with something that's doable. 5 minutes is a doable thing. Start up with that, but you'll find gradually, because of your endeavor, because of your persistence, because of your consistency, things will begin to happen. I'm telling you, it will happen, because intention is everything. So when we think about God, we have to stop going back to unconsciously the God up there, the God out there, the God somewhere else other than right where I am. That's the second thing. You've got to come to understanding that God is right where I am, and that's the most potent place God is present. And the most potent place that God's will shows up is in the present moment now. It's to be in the present moment, because God's will, God's nature, God's power is always in communion with every aspect of life and living, just exactly as it is. Exactly as it is. Not the way my egoic personality, human sense, thinks it should be, but exactly the way it is. So you and I have to come to terms with being good with ourselves exactly the way we are, and blessing ourselves exactly the way we are, and loving ourselves exactly the way we are, because that's how we have been first loved. I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have loved you with an everlasting love. So we are always in that divine love, and that divine love never ever for a moment deserts us or leaves us, no matter what. We're the ones that do the desertion thing. We desert it, but it never deserts us. So there's an awesome power and presence within you right here and right now. Every good thing that your heart could desire, you are equal to demonstrating right here and right now. There's nothing stopping you and blocking you except your fear, your understanding of being separate, your understanding of not being enough, your understanding of I have to wait until I get better and go to this thing and that thing and do this and do that and so on. No! This minute, right here and right now, you could turn on a dime, and so could I, and we could polish up that side of that coin, and we could experience the unity and the oneness that we are in reality with spirit. What is stopping us? Nothing but ourselves. But thank God for the great self of ourselves, who will not let us go until we wake up. So the call this week is wake up, and so it is.